some things happened in my childhood. Will I ever let that go?
Well, it's up to you. And here's the thing that is tricky about it. For someone who hasn't experienced something like that to say, just let it go, well, easy for you to say. But when something happens that is traumatic in nature, and you remember it, and you remember it, and you remember it, and you remember it, you don't leave it in your past because you keep calling it forward every time you remember it. And we're going to tell you a little story that's going to feel off the subject to you, but it isn't. It's right on the subject. And as you hear this, which feels a little off the subject, it will be easier for you to hear, and then we'll go back and apply it to what you're talking about here. So Jerry and Esther are traveling in their monster bus, and they tow a car behind it. And their drive shaft disconnect in the car. They pull a little lever, and it disconnects the drive shaft so they can tow the car. And then when they get to where they're going, they put it back, they re-engage the drive shaft, and now they can drive the car. So the re-engaging process was awkward, and it got out of alignment somehow. And so even though they'd taken it into several shops who thought they'd fixed it, it kept being out of alignment. So Jerry would have to crawl under the car, which was very close quarters, and with a hammer and a screwdriver, visually line it up and hammer it back into place. And he was growing a little weary of doing this. So after 3 or 4 months on this trip of him being under the car almost every time that they re-engaged it, now they're driving one day from San Francisco to San Diego, and they have about 3 more hours before they reach San Diego. And Jerry says to Esther, I'm going to put on my crawling under the car clothes. And when you get there, pull in and pull the car far enough forward that the car is over one of those drainage ditches. It will give me more elbow room as I crawl under the car. And Esther had been really enjoying the drive. It was a beautiful day, and she was feeling so good to be on the open road. And now, because of Jerry's preparation for this inevitable unpleasantry that he expected, now Esther was not having as much fun as she was having before. And she said to him, you know, since we have 3 whole hours before we get there and have to do that dastardly deed, why don't we just think about other things or pretend that it's otherwise until we get there? And she felt some real enthusiasm with that thought. And we said to her, you're really on something, because even though when you get there you might have to crawl under and do that thing you don't want to do, what you do in the next 3 hours doesn't have to be about that. In other words, in the next 3 hours, since you don't have to face it, then why face it? Why not find 3 hours of pleasant things to think about rather than filling these hours with a thought of something that you do? In other words, if they can really get going on that, they can talk about how right there in San Diego, they took it to a shop and the guy said he'd fixed it, and he put it in and put it out while they were there, and they said, oh, hooray, it's fixed, and they drove away, and 400 miles later, it wouldn't work. And then they can talk about how they took it to Coburg, Oregon, and the guy said, oh, not only did I fix it, I took it all apart, and here are the pieces I took out, and here are the pieces I put back in, and now I've really fixed it. And then they pulled it out and they put it in, and it worked while it was there, and then they towed it for another 400 miles, and when they stopped it would, in other words, they could really beat the drum. They could easily fill up 3 hours talking about the injustices that they'd been experiencing with this drive shaft disconnect, or they could find other things that don't make a knot in their belly. And so the point that we were making with them, well, now, so here's the way it played out. So they thought pleasant thoughts, and they thought about other things, and they thought about things that made them laugh, and they felt really, really good for the next 3 hours. And when they got to San Diego, it still wouldn't go in, and Jerry had to crawl under and bang it into place. We thought you'd like that. But the point is, even though that 3 hours wasn't enough to affect the change. In other words, people say, Abraham, I've jumped out of an airplane. I'm at 40,000 feet. I have no parachute. What should I do? And we say, hang on, it will be over soon. So it was sort of like that. In other words, what was going to happen was already in place. And so that 3 hours of positive chatter wasn't enough to change it in that red hot minute. But that 3 hours was enough to soothe it further down the road. And the next 3 hours was enough to soothe it down the road. And the next 3 hours was enough to soothe it down the road, until eventually their manifestation is different. So what we're saying to you, when you live something, and it's the most normal thing in the world, everybody does it. When they live something unwanted or traumatic, The tendency is to remember it, to replay it in your mind, to talk about it. But what people don't realize is that in every moment that you talk about it, you keep it active, which doesn't mean that you're going to attract it necessarily again and again, but it does mean you're having upstream thoughts that are keeping you from the benefit of all of that stuff that is in your vibrational escrow that you could receive otherwise. Mm-hmm. And so we're just suggesting to you that if you want to feel better, you see, the thing that is so interesting about remembering something that happened to you is that you can't go back and unhappen it. You can't go back and make it go away. It happened. But you do have a choice about how active it is in your vibration. You do have a choice about how much attention you call to it. You do have a choice about how hard you push against it. And you live in a world that believes something so backwards. You live in a world that believes that if there's a war against terrorism and a war against drugs and a war against cancer and a war against AIDS and all of those things becoming more, because in this inclusion-based universe, the more you push against something, the more it's active in your vibration, mm-hmm. and the more you use that as your excuse for one more moment to disallow the well-being. So the pain you feel when you think about this childhood trauma is not today because you lived that childhood trauma. Mm-hmm. The pain you feel today is that you've got all this momentum going and you're using that as your excuse not to go. The pain you feel is about not letting yourself get up to speed with who you are. It's not about that thing that happened way back when. Isn't that nice to know? I'm just using that as my current excuse not to stay up to speed with who I am. I could use any number of things as my excuse. I could use a childhood trauma. I could use that injustice, and certainly it was. I could use something that a friend said to me yesterday. I can use any excuse I want to use as my reason not to keep up to speed with who I am. But what it all comes down to is if I don't let myself keep up to speed with who I am, I'm going to feel this pain. So as you feel that pain, and we see it in your face, we can see it in your energy, as you feel that pain, and then you point that pain back to that reason, back to that circumstance that you can't change, because you can't undo something, you can't unlive it. Can you feel the powerlessness that is in that? But when you discover, hey, I can think that thought which is upstream or a thought that turns me downstream, I can feel relief, or I can feel an intensification of that discomfort, or I can feel an ease of that discomfort. Now you've got control of your experience.
Mm-hmm. I understand, and I truly understand it, but I also know at the same time that I am very powerful because I have the gift of power like we all do. We have the gift of choice, and I will choose better as I go up, not against the current, but with the current.
Now here you've come around to something that we really want to say to you, because many of our friends, once they learn about deliberate creation, they work really hard. As we said earlier, they want to turn their boat and put a motor on it. And we want you to take a softer approach to that. Okay. We want you, rather than saying, I'm powerful, that's fine, you are powerful. I'm powerful and I can do this. We want you to more softly say, I don't have to go there. I don't have to do that. I can find other things to think about. In other words, take a softer, easier approach about it, because you've been carrying those thoughts around for a long time and they're pretty active within you. And so if you say to yourself, I'm not going to think about that. I'm bigger than that and I'm smarter than that and I can do better than that for myself. Those are all upstream thoughts. In other words, that's a thought like, I should be doing better. I have the power to do better. Why aren't I doing better? And we don't want any of that. We want you to say things like, well, it's natural that having a trauma like that, I would remember it. It's natural that I would carry this with me for a while. Anybody would. But I can't go back and undo that. And so it's time for me to let it go. And I'm ready to let it go. And my life is so full of so many things now that I could give my attention to. Why I keep recalling something like that. And eventually I'll leave that far behind me. And so much, and also we want to say to you, now we think this is the strongest point for you, and a strong person like you can get hold of this and really do something with it. When Jerry was a child, he was really, really sick. The doctor told his mother several winters in a row that he didn't think that Jerry would survive the winter. It was always a sort of amazement that he made it through yet another winter. And as a result of that trauma and sickness in his childhood, every moment he was sick, his desire to be well was shooting out of him. And every moment he was sick and his desire to be well was shooting before him, the source energy part of him embraced that wellness. And so Jerry became one of the wellest people that you will ever meet as a result of that. In other words, when you know what you don't want, what you do want gets out there. And once he began to release the resistance of the trauma in his childhood and began to accept the empowerment of his own experience so that he went with the flow instead of against the flow, then the wellness that the illness had created became his. You get us? And so what we're saying is some of the people that are living the most extraordinary lives today are those that had the most outrageous childhoods. And it's because in that outrageous childhood, you sent more forward. And further, we want to say to you, sometimes people will say, well, why would that happen to a child? Why would a child, if we're source energy, why would a child even be born into a situation where something like that could happen? And we say, because the wisdom of your source energy said, I want to hit the ground running. I want some experiences early on that get some stuff in my vibrational escrow. That's where your strength comes from. That's where the formation of who you are begins to come from. In other words, we're certainly not encouraging tragedy in order to build character, and we're certainly not encouraging trauma in order to get stuff going on in your vibrational escrow. We'd far rather that you live life and want something and then turn your attention to it and become it, and then live life and want something and turn your attention to it and become it. In other words, they don't write many books about you. They write the books about those that dig big, deep holes and get themselves in big, big problems. And then when they climb out, everyone applauds. And so there is a lot of satisfaction for humans in that uphill stream. But what we're saying to you is who you are as a source energy, as the source energy in your physical body expansion of you, who you have become is in large part because of things like that. And so when you understand how good this is, then you no longer want to condemn some of the reasons that this exists. That so many physical beings say, oh, Abraham, the world has so many bad things. If we're source energy, why wouldn't we just come into a world where there are only things that we want? And we say, because you know that the contrast is what gives birth to the clarity, and that the very eternal nature of our eternal beings is dependent upon this variety. And how you play with the variety, that's what you said. You said, I'll go forth and I'll learn about this contrast and I'll learn to play positively within the variety. And so now you know all of that. So now it's time for you to just play positively within the variety and let that bad stuff go.
Thank you.
You have nothing to explain to anybody. You don't need any apology from anyone. You will never be able to reason it out in order to understand why it happens. You'll never be able to explain it in any satisfactory way. Just having lived it and having become as a result of it, now go to what you have become.
Thank you.
Yes.